Let's travel back in time to the heartland of America, when St. Louis was on the rise. But beneath its shimmering face lurked a dark secret, a stain on the nation. You see, in the 1950s, St. Louis set out on a grand experiment of urban housing, an ambitious project to resolve their never-ending housing crisis. The solution? The Pruitt-Igoe housing estate. Although initially, at least, this solution was a beacon of hope, it swiftly became a haunting symbol of failure, one that would stoke the flames of America's greatest divide. So join us as we discover the rise and fall of St. Louis's worst housing project. This is the story of Pruitt-Igoe. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Our story starts in St. Louis, Missouri, which at the time was becoming one of the most important cities in the United States. St. Louis was a vital railroad and river terminus, a center for developing automotive traffic, and a site for the first Olympic Games held in the country. Although the city suffered with the rest of the nation through the Great Depression, by the 1950s, it was still growing at the same rate. To elaborate, back in the 50s, St. Louis had 850,000 residents and citizens, and planners expected it to keep growing. Thankfully, the 1949 Housing Act gave cities like St. Louis a chance to expand access to affordable housing across the city. Now, how they got this funding, well, that requires some crucial explanations. For starters, federal assistance funding was secured by identifying areas of high density and low wages, growing populations with less access to new homes, or, for a lack of better words, simply identifying neighborhoods as slums. The city and others could identify these neighborhoods for redevelopment and demolition, so they did. Mayors Joseph Durst and later Raymond Tucker wanted to remove these slum districts and replace them with apartments for more affluent and socially valued residents. So yes, this effort was initially intended to be segregated. The documentary film published in 2001, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, drew attention to the disturbing undertone of what this urban renewal really was. To mayors and politicians like Durst and Tucker, St. Louis, as well as many other cities across America, particularly in the South and Midwest, had a problem: white flight. This continuous migration northwards of African Americans from the inhumane treatment of segregation of the South caused many white Americans to go west and further north themselves, taking their tax dollars along with them. Anyhow, this depopulation and social exodus was reacted to about as well as you'd expect from most white Americans and regional governments. It's important to note that sites like Pruitt-Igoe were the rule, not the exception, so let's have a look at how it came to be. The two lead architects of the eventual housing complex were George Hellmuth and Minoru Yamasaki. Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect and engineer, had a special sensitivity to the constant racial discrimination of his time. The son of poor immigrants to Seattle, he personally grew up learning how to deal with it. He told Time magazine, quote, "A word that I had heard repeatedly whenever there would be an incident or slight was shikatagane, which means it can't be helped." And I also don't know how to pronounce that, but you guys will get me in the comment section, won't you? Okay, moving forward. Gifted in mathematics and encouraged by a visit from a relative who recently earned his architecture degree, he enrolled at the University of Washington, paying his way thanks to work at a fish cannery. Then, he graduated with his degree in 1934 and moved to New York for a decade of equally grueling apprenticeships. I'd also point out, and quite astonishingly given his Japanese heritage, that he managed to escape the war-period internment camps. Anyhow, he rose to fame by combining modernism and humanism in his architecture for the good of functionalism and the individual human experience. But with Pruitt-Igoe as his first leading project, that type of fame honestly could not have been predicted. George Francis Hellmuth, on the other hand, was much more traditional. He was the son of a prominent architect, George W. Hellmuth, and served as a city and infrastructure architect for St. Louis for most of his career. And so it was. These two men, bound by nothing more than a common project, would make one of the biggest housing complexes in the city. How they went about it would decide how generations of St. Louis citizens lived. And with that context, let's go ahead and take a tour of the former Pruitt-Igoe complex. The project was two different facilities meant for two distinct classes of people. The Pruitt half was named after Wendell Oliver Pruitt, a local man who flew P-47 Jugs and P-51 Mustangs during World War II, primarily flying in the Mediterranean and Italian theaters with the rest of the famous Red Tails. He scored at least 3 kills on German aircraft and was promoted to captain before unfortunately dying in a training accident in April of 1945. The other half was named for Missouri Congressman William L. Igoe, who served over 6 years as a representative in Washington, D.C. But if you pay attention to the numbers I just gave you, you might already notice that there was a problem. Anyhow, each of these men was a decent namesake for the housing project, especially Captain Pruitt. Still, they immediately acknowledged through the very naming of this facility that it was destined for segregation by race, with Igoe being a third of the buildings and intended for white residents only. Nevertheless, sociologist Elizabeth Birmingham said that the complex was designed to provide all tenants with the 3 essential joys of urbanism: sun, space, and greenery. A variety of 33 and 11-story apartment blocks were spread out to provide natural sunlight, parks, and green spaces, as well as a natural flow of traffic through the neighborhood and city. Yamasaki described the green spaces and ease of movement as, quote, a river of trees, whereas others compared the estate to hospitals, as the environment was sterile and hygienic. So this was imagined to be a place where children and families could relax, play freely, without concerns about crime or traffic. 12,000 tenants were meant to call the 57-acre project home. My favorite description came from David Chipperfield, a renowned British architect, who exclaimed, quote, the almost brutally spare, unadorned surfaces were to reflect the dissolution of the old hierarchies that made luxurious decoration a demarcator of wealth. And there were some unrealized aspects of the plan that would have made this neighborhood truly special. For example, they did away with the traditional divides in more isolated apartments and high-rises that would allow for neighbors to interact quickly and regularly via large galleries on the 3rd floor. Unfortunately, a lack of funding from investors or the city forced Yamasaki to revise the design for cost cutting. Basically, he was forced to double the density of the buildings and cancel plans for playgrounds, parks, laundromats, grocers, and even public toilets. Apparently, these reductions were pushed from the Helmuth side of the architecture partnership, with Yamasaki recalling, quote, I tried and fought at every turn for amenities, but was denied by a general apathy from the city and state. What's worse, while it was still under construction, the Supreme Court handed down its verdict on Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring segregation by separate but equal means as the rule of the land. In practice, this forced the Igoe neighborhood to be African American, and the combined project's residents would at first be about 98% African American. Bureaucracy and court rulings forced Yamasaki to change his vision completely. The project was no longer a clear message of equality despite class and race. Rather, it was enforcement of segregation. So the Pruitt-Igoe homes, meant to unite people, became a, quote, structure that deepened pre-existing chasms between African Americans and cultural integrity. The media and other architects had heralded Yamasaki's original version of the buildings as a marvelous innovation of public housing, but how were the real final projects perceived as they were finished in 1956, you might ask? At the start, tenants moving in from the mostly demolished former slum district were pleased, despite the low construction quality caused by insufficient funding and constraints encountered by the Korean War. Former tenant Ruby Russell would later tell a documentary filmmaker, quote, it was a wonderful place, like a big hotel resort. I'd say with plenty of green grass, trees, shrubbery, and all the works. Jacqueline Williams, another person interviewed, told the film how in their former home, her mother had to sleep on the floor. So when moving into Pruitt-Igoe, one of the most exciting things was that everyone had a bed. She exclaimed, quote, it was one of the most exciting things in my life, like another world. Everybody had a bed. My mom had her bed, and I was so happy to see her in a room with a door. In 1957, the facility's occupancy rate was an incredible 91%, but by the following year, it dropped noticeably, as all those who could move to better homes did. Now, this had several factors we'll cover, but while land clearance for large capacity high rises, new and affordable suburban neighborhoods, and federal highway programs had temporarily created a boom in the city's demand for housing, by the start of the 1960s, the demand naturally tapered off because of migration out of the town and into cheaper family homes. So, solutions like Pruitt-Igoe apartments just weren't necessary anymore, sparking the fatal feedback loop that all administrators and companies feared: the battle between income and expense. As occupancy fell, the average income of tenants also shrank. In a story all too familiar for regular viewers, the signatories for these apartments rapidly became women with multiple children and no spouse. In fact, I can confidently say in this case, compared to projects previously covered on our channel, it was even worse. You see, the Missouri Welfare Department had included a so-called man in the house rule on any woman who took welfare or government benefits for dependent children. This rule, for whatever reason, kept these women from living with men even if they were married. They also weren't allowed, inevitably, to have telephones or TV. In other words, tenants were left at the mercy of the system. Candace Borders actually had an interesting essay on this topic where tenants described how their husbands and fathers had to hide their belongings and themselves in the closet as their spouse and children were forced to lie and tell welfare workers a man did not live in the apartment so that he or the family would not be fined or evicted. Rather than living up to its goal of bringing tenants together as a neighborhood, the system began to make them feel nervous and isolated. Resident Brianna King said it felt like the housing authority was saying, quote, "You're bad. We have to restrain you and curtail what you're doing." It was devoid of humanity. It seemed like more of a prison environment that you had to escape from. Federal law required the housing authority to fund maintenance and general repairs through rent collected from the local tenants. As occupancy fell, so did the regularity and quality of maintenance. Maintenance shortfalls encouraged vandalism, eventually spiraling into violent crime on the open gallery floors and public spaces around the buildings. At first, good oversight and carefully applied funding might have saved the buildings, but as you can probably already tell, that didn't and wouldn't happen. The slow, familiar death spiral continued until finally, in 1965, federally approved aid reached the complex for repairs, upgrades, and a general rejuvenation of the space. This was the first of several similar efforts, but they could have been more effective at stopping the hemorrhaging of people and finances. In 1969, the remaining tenants of not only Pruitt-Igoe but other St. Louis housing projects went on a 9-month rent strike. To show their frustration, this was the final straw for the project. The housing authority was exhausted economically, administratively, and now financially. At this point, even if extreme amounts of funding could be moved in to improve the site, no one, not even the tenants, would choose to use it for these apartments. The city began to investigate these means of demolition, moving all the tower's residents into just 11 of the 33 blocks, a staggering display of how low residency had fallen. On March the 16th, 1972, 3 vacant buildings were successfully imploded. Seeing that as the most efficient method, the city began methodically erasing the buildings, even as minor and last-minute repairs were made to some of the occupied towers, all the way up to 1973. This process continued all the way up to 1976, at which point the estate had vanished from St. Louis's horizon. These buildings, meant to house more than 12,000 people in a growing St. Louis, were all gone in under 20 years. The end of the Pruitt-Igoe apartments would be an iconic image for architects and urban planners for decades. The photos of the final buildings coming down in a cloud of smoke, dust, and rubble became more prominent than any other picture of the complex while it was still standing. And even before this happened, the blame was being placed on the victims. The myth, as it was, became that the tenants became the downfall of the apartment buildings. One particularly nasty case of this came from an article from the Washington Post, citing that there was an incompatibility between the high-rise structure and the large poor families who came to inhabit it, only a generation removed from the farm. From the beginning, it was easy to blame the architecture and the people rather than the system and the broader circumstances that the city created and was subject to. Catherine Bristol argued that it was neither the building style nor the people that created the final downfall of the housing project. She attributed the whole situation to, quote, institutionalized economic and racial oppression, whereas many feel that the truth lies somewhere in between. Nevertheless, the accepted narrative was that the tenants caused the downfall until much more recently in academic discussion. Since then, many papers have investigated the problem with multiple angles, approaches, and let's just say writing styles. One of the most compelling pieces is a short article by Timothy J. Fox with a rather interesting and complex historical angle. To explain that, I'd like to tell you another story for a minute before we entirely conclude here. So just stick with me. Let's go back to 1904, when St. Louis hosted the World's Fair on the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase. The fair, intended to welcome visitors from the city and across the country into an artificial, ambiguous past and optimistic future. The buildings across over 1,000 acres of land were from various locations, periods, and architectural styles. But inside the exhibition buildings and great tents, this image disappeared. The fair displayed the latest mining, transportation, and general industry technologies, merging the past and future. The buildings themselves were a lie in a way. The fairground was only allowed to be used for a while. In other words, each building's exterior was built from cheap material known as staff, a mixture of plastic and hemp fibers that would be easily removed at the end of the festival. So what's my point? Well, the entire fair was a lie, meant to sell the image of a future created by a handful of architects and industrialists. The Pruitt-Igoe homes, also in St. Louis, were similar. However, while the architects attempted to approach it humanely, the aforementioned greater circumstances and budget cuts killed their romantic version of the program. The building's slick exteriors, solid steel and concrete construction, and skipping elevators represented the city's modernity. However, critic Charles Jenks eventually wrote about the complex in two separate papers, reading, quote, "Its purest style, its clean, salubrious hospital metaphor was meant to instill, by good example, corresponding virtues in its inhabitants, and that social idealism had led to social catastrophe. Inside, and at its very conception, it was a tool to beautify and redevelop the city's image, cleaning out the slums not just for the good of the people living there, but because it made the city and government look bad, leading some to feel that the casualties of this affair were ultimately the tenants and the image of modernist architecture. Critics no longer defend the Pruitt-Igoe homes themselves, nor do its builders and tenants escape. As explained by sociologist Elizabeth Birmingham, quote, "The generally held belief fostered in modern architecture is that technological societies share a common cultural denominator. Each culture retains strong links to its past." And so one way of expressing these connections is through visual traditions, a practice which has been intentionally excluded from modern cities worldwide. The cultural loss is real, and people from all walks of life sense it. Despite the failure of the Pruitt-Igoe project, its architects would go on to have long and successful careers, especially Yamasaki, who would later project St. Louis's main airport terminal, auditorium, the Pacific Science Center, the New York City World Trade Center, and many other buildings worldwide. So what's my takeaway? Well, I feel the downfall of this project lay in the hands of many, in particular the Housing Authority, which stacked the deck against the residents, as though they were incapable of making fundamental life decisions. Then there's the notion that the concept was rotten and born from a few men's ambition to reshape the city into something cleaner, more modern and affluent, rather than addressing the real problems, just kind of sweeping the mess under the rug and pretending that everything is normal. Whereas for the tenants, some do hold the belief that regardless of your situation, you have to take ownership of your own destiny. But I'd love to know what you all think. Maybe we can reach a conclusion by further discussing this in the comment section below. Anyhow, all that's left today is an urban, empty forest slowly being filled in by new homes and businesses, moving in year after year. Perhaps it's for the best that these towers are gone, but they will never be forgotten. And we'll leave it there for today, but I do hope you'll consider subscribing and clicking that join button to support the channel. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.